The court system in the United States can be rather confusing. It's complicated, but let's try to work our way through it so that we have a better understanding about the federal courts, state courts, and also some city courts and municipal courts as well. Hello, I'm Professor Harper, and welcome to another lecture for Journalism and the Law at Temple University. I'm sure that you've all watched Law and Order, various cop shows, and legal issues. And to a certain extent, these programs do provide an interesting overview of how the court system works. But most of the television programs deal with state courts, and much of the action actually happens in state courts. But let me start with the federal court system first of all. Okay, the role of the courts is that courts are used to settle civil disputes. So keep in mind there are criminal courts which deal with crimes and civil courts which deal with disputes among people concerning money, divorce, that type of thing. And the courts help ensure that everyone has the ability to have equal opportunities under the law. And in criminal courts, courts use the law to decide the guilt or innocence of people accused of crimes. So what happens? So both sides come to the court and present their position. Okay, the court applies the law to the facts that have been presented and makes a decision in favor of one or the other. In a criminal trial, each side presents witnesses, and witnesses present evidence. In a criminal trial, you have a prosecutor who represents the state or the federal government. Then you have a defense lawyer who represents the individual who's been accused of a crime. Then a jury or a judge delivers the verdict. Now, in a criminal trial, here's where you have that guilt has to be beyond a reasonable doubt, and emphasize reasonable doubt rather than any doubt, and the jury has to give a unanimous decision. Now, when we come to the issue of equal treatment, every person has the right to have a public trial with a lawyer. This was a very important decision before the Supreme Court involving a defendant called Gideon. The accused who cannot afford their lawyer will have one appointed, and defendants are innocent until proven guilty. This is a criminal trial. In the federal courts, which was established by the U.S. Constitution in Article 3, Section 1, the judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court, and in such inferior courts as the Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. So, as I mentioned in the lecture concerning the U.S. Constitution, the founders said we need one court. And we're going to need others, but we're not going to spell out exactly what those courts will be. Okay? So in the Judiciary Act of 1789, the Congress created federal district courts and circuit courts. Okay? Then in the Judiciary Act of 1891, Congress established the system of federal appeals courts. So we had the U.S. Supreme Court, the highest court of the land, established first of all. Then federal district courts, essentially the lowest court in the federal system. And then just before the turn of the 20th century, there was an intermediate group which were appeals courts. So at the bottom, you have U.S. district courts, you have U.S. courts of appeals, and then you have the U.S. Supreme Court. Those are separate from state courts, which have a similar structure for the most part. So the jurisdiction of the federal courts is the Constitution. A person who believes a constitutional right has been violated can be heard in federal court. Federal laws, people accused of federal crimes are tried in federal courts. Civil cases involving federal laws. Also disputes between two states. Okay? And here the U.S. Supreme Court is the court that decides a dispute between Pennsylvania and New Jersey over the Delaware River and its use. Okay? Or maybe we throw Delaware in there as well. Okay? And citizens from two different states. Okay? two different people from different states can have a lawsuit and it can be heard in federal court. This is important when it comes to libel law, for example. So I was involved in a case which involves CBS News, which is incorporated in Delaware, and the person bringing the case was a resident of Pennsylvania. Because of this, it was decided that the case should be held in federal court, even though the libel and defamation law of Pennsylvania was the one that was applied. Okay, the federal government is also goes to a federal court if the federal government is part of a lawsuit, if the federal government takes a person or company to court. Also, when it involves disputes between foreign governments or ambassadors or treaties, it goes to the U.S. Supreme Court. And anything to do with admiralty and maritime laws, which are incidents that take place on the high seas or international waters, or just in civil claims or criminal claims for that matter, involving a U.S. Vessel. It also a federal court also hears cases when it concerns U.S. diplomats. So, under the federal court system, there are two types of jurisdiction: exclusive jurisdiction, where only the federal courts may hear a case. An example of this, it is a crime to threaten the President of the United States. If someone threatens to kill the President of the United States, that can only be heard in a federal court, even though such a threat would normally be heard in a state court. So state courts deal with most crimes: murder, rape, robbery, burglary, etc., etc. There also can be concurrent jurisdiction, which basically means that the case can take place in either the state or the federal court. My example of the libel case is one example of this, where the libel case could have been heard in the state of Pennsylvania, it could have been heard in the state of Delaware, or it can be heard in federal court. In this case, CBS News decided that they wanted the jurisdiction in federal court. What's the reason for that? The procedures in federal court are different from state court. The judges are in federal court are appointed for life, so maybe there is less of a political inclination on the part of judges. Not necessarily going there to cast aspersions on state judges, but there may be reasons that CBS in this case decided to go to federal court rather than to state court. Okay, now the U.S. Court of Appeals is also called a federal appeals court, a circuit court of appeals. There are circuit courts, appellate courts, and what they do is that when there's a disagreement over a decision in a U.S. district court, the plaintiff, the defendant in a civil case, we call it the plaintiff in a civil case and defendant in a civil case, whereas in a criminal case we call it the prosecutor and the defendant, can appeal to the U.S. Court of Appeals to say, we think that this was a bad decision and here are the following reasons why. Now, the U.S. Court of Appeals doesn't have to accept every case, neither does the U.S. Supreme Court, and so they grant the opportunity for that case to be heard at the U.S. Appellate level or the U.S. Supreme Court level. Okay? The U.S. Court of Appeals and the U.S. Supreme Court, they do not conduct trials. Okay? They review the evidence that was presented at trial. There can be arguments made by the lawyers, but the U.S. Court of Appeals and the U.S. Supreme Court do not conduct trials. In the U.S. Court of Appeals, each circuit has from 6 to 28 judges, and it's based on how busy the circuit has been historically. They can review the procedure from a case in a federal district court. They can review the actions of federal regulatory agencies. So in the case of the Federal Communications Commission, for example, the FCC replaces the U.S. District Court as the first place people will go to bring a civil procedure um, involving the FCC. Okay? When it comes to how the U.S. Court of Appeals are organized, there are a total of 13 federal appeals circuits. There are 12 circuit courts that basically hear appeals from a geographic area or a circuit. There's one court of appeals for the federal circuit located in Washington, D.C. that hears special cases that cover the entire nation. The U.S. Court of Appeals in Washington, D.C. is a very powerful court, and many of the Supreme Court justices historically have served uh, as uh, as justices in the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit in Washington. So the decisions of the U.S. Court of Appeals is to make sure that a defendant received a fair trial, usually in a criminal case. After reviewing the procedure of the case, the appeals court may do several things. It can uphold the lower court's decision, basically saying, okay, we think that the judge and the jury basically made the right decision. They can say, oh, they totally messed up, and they reverse the lower court's decision. And usually what happens if there's some disagreement is that they remand the case back to the district court. What this means is they say, okay, we think you made a bad decision here, and we want you to determine whether there should be a new trial. Or in some cases they will say, you must give this person a new trial. Now, an opinion is the official decision of an appeals court. It sets out how the court feels about the way the lower court handled the case, and any rulings that the U.S. Court of Appeals becomes a precedent. It becomes the foundation for future cases. Now, sometimes a court decision will stop here in the appeals process, but the parties can appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. Again, the U.S. Supreme Court must grant the plaintiff, the prosecutor, or the defendant the ability to have their cases heard before the U.S. Supreme Court. And many times the U.S. Supreme Court will say, we think that the U.S. Court of Appeals or the U.S. District Court made mistakes. Now, a precedent. The U.S. Supreme Court and appellate courts cannot seek out an issue. I can't, if U.S. Supreme Court Justice Christopher Harper can't go to the local bar and say, you know what, you've got a really good case here, and I'm going to take it to the Supreme Court because I'm a Supreme Court Justice. Okay, can't do that. The court must wait for people themselves to take someone to court over the issue. Okay, precedents are not new laws, but help clarify existing laws. Sometimes what the U.S. Supreme Court will say is that, we think that the law that the Congress passed is unconstitutional, and we think that the U.S. Congress needs to go back, and we're going to force them to do that and they need to make a new law because we found that this goes against the Constitution. Okay? The decisions from the higher courts must be followed by the lower courts. If they're not, it's going to be a slam dunk for whoever, says the U.S. District Court is not following what the U.S. Court of Appeals or the U.S. Supreme Court said. Okay, and that the U.S. Supreme Court or the U.S. Court of Appeals is saying, yep, you're right, and the U.S. District Court judge is going to be in hot water if he or she does not follow what the Supreme Court says. Okay, an opinion by the U.S. Supreme Court must be followed by everyone. Now, going back to the U.S. District Courts, okay, this is where federal lawsuits begin. This is where trials occur in the federal system. They have what's called original jurisdiction. There are 94 U.S. District Courts throughout the country, and they have trials with witnesses, evidence, a jury that gives a verdict, and every state has at least one federal district court. Federal judges are appointed by the president. The Senate approves their appointment. The president usually chooses someone with the same ideas about politics, justice, and the issues, because federal judges have their job for life unless they're removed by the impeachment or removal process. The goal with life tenure is to put judges above politics instead of having to please voter with their ideas. Um, and you'll see in many states, including Pennsylvania, the uh, the Pennsylvania State Supreme Court, those justices are elected. In fact, in the past election, there were a lot of problems on the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, and there were 3 justices who were elected to sort out the problems at the Pennsylvania State Supreme Court. So in Pennsylvania and in other states, many of the judges are elected rather than appointed. There are magistrates who issue arrest and search warrants. They hear preliminary evidence to determine if a case should be brought to trial. The U.S. magistrates determine bail, and they may hear some minor cases. Okay? They're important in the federal court system, but they they basically are involved in process in most instances rather than making a determination of guilt or innocence. There are U.S. attorneys who are the individual is a lawyer for the U.S. government. They can have at least one deputy. They prosecute criminals. They represent the U.S. government in lawsuits. They're appointed to 4-year terms by the president with the approval of the Senate. These are very powerful figures in the federal system. There are U.S. Marshals. Maybe you saw the program, which was a very good television program called In Plain Sight, which was involved with the Witness Protection Program. They are U.S. Marshals. Please note that Marshal is spelled with 1 L. What they are federal police officers. They make arrests, they collect fines, they escort convicts to prison, they protect jurors, they keep order in federal courts, and they serve legal papers such as subpoenas. So let's look at the Pennsylvania court system. And while there are some differences between Pennsylvania and other states, it's a similar structure in many places throughout the United States. So in Pennsylvania, what's the job of the state courts? Okay, they provide 2 important jobs. They settle disputes between citizens and the state government, and they act as a check on the conduct of all state governments through judicial review. So the courts in Pennsylvania go back a long time, so that William Penn created a court system in 1682 under the control of the Pennsylvania governor, but the problem was it was very unpopular because it was enforced by the British government. In 1722, the Penn system of courts was abolished by the state legislature, and it was the beginning of the court system that we have today in Pennsylvania. So at the bottom, you have special courts, magisterial district judges, Pennsylvania municipal courts, other city courts, and they're important to us, on a daily basis, but they're not particularly important for what we do in this class on First Amendment and constitutional law. The Court of Common Pleas is the first court that many cases go to. So if you are accused of theft, stealing an automobile, for example, or something more important like rape or murder, in a criminal sense, you go to the Court of Common Pleas. That's on the criminal side. On the civil side, also a case like divorce or libel, defamation, will also go to the Court of Common Pleas. Okay. Then you have 2 appeals court, the Commonwealth Court and the Superior Court in Pennsylvania, and then you have the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. So if you look at the pyramid here, the Court of Common Pleas is where most of the action happens. Then it can be appealed to the Commonwealth or Superior Courts, and then it can be appealed to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. So in looking at the highest court in the state of Pennsylvania, it's the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. It was founded in 1722, and it's one of the oldest state courts in the United States. The Supreme Court has 7 justices. They serve a 10-year term. As I mentioned before, they're elected to the court. The Chief Justice is the leader, and justices may retire from the court at the age of 70, but they're forced to retire at the age of 78. In the federal court system, there's not a mandatory retirement age. So at the U.S. Supreme Court, for example, you have Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who's 83 years old, and it doesn't appear as though she's going to retire anytime soon. Now, what kind of cases does the Supreme Court hear? In Pennsylvania, cases of statewide importance, cases that require some clarification of Pennsylvania law. The court also oversees cases involving the death penalty, so all death penalty cases go to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. Appeals from the state's Commonwealth Court, and they grant what's called allocatur, which is the permission for someone's case to be heard. So on the average, the court receives about 2,500 appeals each year and only hears less than 100. So there is someone who helps the Supreme Court. It's an unpaid lawyer who advises the court. He makes sure that the decisions are not biased and basically oversees the agenda and the research. Okay? So under the Supreme Court, there are two courts, the Superior Court and the Commonwealth Court. And both courts operate as kind of filters for the Supreme Court to ease the workload. Okay? So the Superior Court handles reviews and appeals for county courts. Okay? It is more important for us is to look at, how these courts work. It's made up of 15 justices. Again, they have 10-year terms. They operate in panels of 3. So, 3 people will decide, generally 2-1 or 3-0, what will be done with appeal. Again, it's important to keep in mind that these courts do not hear actual cases. Okay, that's done at the Commonwealth Court level. The Court of Common Pleas. Okay, so the Commonwealth Court hears very specific things, so that we're mainly concerned about the superior courts as the appellate courts. The Commonwealth Court hears cases concerning banking, insurance, taxation, elections, labor disputes, workers' compensation. So it does very specific things. Sometimes these cases can go up to the state Supreme Court, but when it comes to First Amendment issues, most of the time we're not concerned with the decisions of the Commonwealth Court. Okay? Again, panels of 3. Often the verdicts are final. It's made up of 9 justices, and they serve for a 10-year term. The Court of Common Pleas is where most of the action happens. The Court of Common Pleas are the everyday county courts of Pennsylvania. And keep in mind there are 2 types of cases. A civil case, which involves money or disputes where people disagree on something, and a criminal court where someone's actually accused of a crime. But the Court of Common Pleas hears adoption, divorce, criminal cases, guardianship, estates. Many cases go to the Court of Common Pleas. So that's a look at the federal court system and the Pennsylvania court system. I hope it's given you a better understanding of how they work, but we'll be discussing them in the weeks ahead. So, thanks very much, and we'll see you online.